Israeli citizens are rioting in the streets in support of the right to rape Palestinians, while Israeli politicians are debating the right to rape Palestinians. Now, you might think this must be hyperbole, that I must be exaggerating, this simply cannot be happening, that's been distorted, taken out of context. This is exactly what's happening. Let's just be clear about that. In a society in which genocidal mania is spinning out of control. Now, there have been repeated multiple reports of Palestinian women and men being raped and sexually abused and systematically tortured by the Israeli state for months. And I must make it clear, long before the 7th of October. Now, you may recall that in May, the International Criminal Court's chief prosecutor issued requests for arrest warrants for war crimes and crimes against humanity against both Hamas and Israeli leaders. But whilst those requests for arrest warrants specified torture in the case of Hamas, they did not do so in the case of the Israeli state, not yet anyway, despite an abundance of evidence. Now, the International Criminal Court issues requests for arrest warrants if it does not believe the judicial system of a state is capable of taking action itself. This is the principle of complementarity outlined by Parliamentarians for Global Action as follows. The ICC may only exercise jurisdiction when national legal systems fail to do so, when it is demonstrated that they are unwilling or unable to genuinely carry out proceedings. This may explain why, after months of reports of torture and rape, Israeli military police today sought to arrest 9 Israeli soldiers in the Stay Taiman facility, which is described by a lawyer in an interview with the Israeli magazine Plus 972 magazine last month as more horrific than Abu Ghraib. Now, before I just say more about that interview, the point is this. They know that there is overwhelming evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and that the initial request details some crimes, but not many crimes. It doesn't even go into, for example, the bombing campaign in Gaza. It focuses primarily on starvation, on the depriving of necessities of life from a civilian population. So clearly this is an attempt to forestall that. Now, there was a history of, within Israel, of very few soldiers being held accountable, that even when they're you have examples of soldiers being tried, that either they have no punishment or just a minimal punishment, which is in no way proportionate to the crime. So bear that in mind. Now, the interview in Plus 972 magazine included testimonies of Palestinians being raped with a stick in front of the detainees, backing up similar testimonies published in CNN and the New York Times. The interview also detailed other reports of a Palestinian prisoner declaring he had personally witnessed multiple rapes and cases in which Israeli soldiers made dogs sexually assault prisoners, and I'm sorry for having to go through these details. There are now endless reports of Palestinian prisoners being tortured to death by their Israeli captors, while others have had their limbs amputated because of them being restrained for so long during their ordeal. All the evidence suggests that torture has been used on an industrial scale against those detained by the Israeli state, many of them not charged with anything and not guilty of anything other than being a Palestinian, as we'll discuss. Now, according to the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, when Israeli military police raided Stay Taiman, the soldiers mutinied, reportedly spraying pepper spray at the military personnel arriving to detain the Israeli suspects. The Palestinian detainee was reportedly taken to hospital with severe injuries to what is described in Haaretz as an intimate body part, with injuries leaving him unable to walk. Then Israeli citizens and Israeli politicians, including ministers, marched on the base and rioted in support of the soldiers. Prem Thacker, reporter with Zetio, was there on the scene and recorded some of what happened. When the soldiers were taken to a military court, violent mobs charged it in an effort to free the detained soldiers. Let's see. Armed militias have claimed they've taken over military courts.
מאיפה אתם פוחדים? כנסו, אל תפחדו. יש כל לוחמים בפנים, כנסו.
לוחמינו הגיבורים, אנחנו איתכם!
Now, as Prem Thacker notes, Israeli forces have routinely used fists, tear gas, snipers, and tanks against Palestinians existing. Mobs attacking a military court to protest holding soldiers accountable for sexual abuse are met with man-to-man pleas to calm down and shoves. Meanwhile, the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, has debated whether it's acceptable to rape prisoners. This is not a sick joke, it's exactly what happened. Let's listen with subtitles provided by the anonymous and brilliant Israeli peace activist who goes by the to-the-point handle at I really hate you.
אני לא יודע אם יודעים, אבל יש אירוע כרגע בשדה תימן שמשטרה צבאית הגיעו לעצור חיילים ששמרו על מחבלי נוח'בה. והחיילים בשדה תימן, מתקן מעצר של מחבלי נוח'בה, ומשטרה צבאית שם הגיעה לעצור כמה לוחמים שם שכנראה בגלל איזה שהם טענות של יחס למחבלי נוח'בה, ויש שם אירוע של התבצרות וכולי. הטרלול שהמדינה שלנו נכנסת אליו סביב הסיפור הזה הוא מטורף וצריך להפסיק אותו, ואני חושב שצריך פה לתת דוגמה אישית, ואני אומר עכשיו, ואני קורא לחברי הקואליציה לעשות כמוני, אני קם ואני יוצא מפה, ואני לא הולך להצביע יותר על שום דבר, עד שהסיפור הזה והטרלול הזה, שיש מי שבפרקליטות חושב שאפשר לבוא ולעצור חיילים על דברים שעושים למחבלי נוח'בה, לא נגמר. אוקיי? ואני מאוד מבקש, ואני חושב שחבריי בקואליציה טוב יעשו, אם יעשו כמוני. אנחנו לא יכולים להמשיך כרגיל.
להכניס מקל לרקטום של בן אדם, זה לגיטימי?
כן, אם הוא נוח'בה, הכל לגיטימי לעשות לו.
אוקיי.
הכל.
מצוין.
הכל.
זה מה שרציתי.
הכל, האנשים האלה, אתה יודע מה עשו?
אוקיי.
טוב.
יש דברים שלא עושים.
So when the Palestinian politician Ahmed Tibi asks to insert a stick in a person's rectum is what is legitimate, Hanak Milfizki from Likud, the ruling party, to which, of course, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu himself belongs and is Prime Minister of, angrily yells back, yes, if he is a Nukba, everything is legitimate to do to him. A Nukba being a Hamas militant. Now, the finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, published a video message demanding Israel's military advocate general takes her hands off what he calls Israel's heroic warriors. The national security minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, announced the arrests were nothing less than shameful, adding that the defense minister, IDF chief, and the military authorities need to back the fighters and learn from the prison service. And that's, by the way, it should be clear, he heads it, adding light treatment of terrorists is over. Soldiers, he says, need to have our full support. The Justice Minister, Yariv Levin, said he was shocked to see harsh pictures of soldiers being arrested, and that it was impossible to accept this treatment. I mean, just listen to this. Do you really think this is a state which is in any way capable of trying these people? Now, let's be clear. We're talking about rape here. We're about using rape to torture prisoners. Bear in mind, many of these prisoners haven't even been charged with anything. Now, the estimate offered by a Palestinian prisoners' rights organisation is that there were 3,380 Palestinian prisoners held as administrative detainees. That's charged without charge or trial. But crucially, that excludes those from Gaza. We have absolutely no idea how many people from Gaza are being detained without charge. But we can imagine, based on those existing statistics excluding Gaza, that is a huge number, given, of course, that's where the military operation is focused. We know that hundreds of Palestinian kids have been detained and that charities warn they're being starved and having their bones broken in detention. Now, in this case, 4 of the soldiers accused of raping this Palestinian man are being represented by a legal aid organisation named Honenu. And guess what the defence they're using is? Self-defence. Now, let's listen to this from Erez Tadmor, the speechwriter, former speechwriter Benjamin Netanyahu.
קודם כל, אנחנו לא יודעים מה קרה או לא קרה במקרה הזה. אני לא הייתי מוציא מכלל אפשרות את זה שהמחבלים פגעו אחד בשני ועשו אחד לשני את המעשים המטונפים שהם רגילים או חינכו אותם לבצע. That's right. He claimed Palestinian detainees raped themselves. Now, a few things. Firstly, there's a long history involving the Israeli state and rape and sexual abuse. Hedi Viterbo, a senior lecturer in law at Queen Mary University of London, writes a detailed Twitter thread about this history, including reports of the rape of Palestinians during the 1948 Nakba, or catastrophe, which accompanied the foundation of Israel, of reports in 2010 of the Israeli state sexually assaulting Palestinian children, and indeed Save the Children in 2023 found Palestinian child detainees were being sexually abused in Israeli military detention. But let me read out, too, this post from an Israeli analyst named Shael Ben Ephraim. He says, I feel stupid and ashamed. In May, an expose came out
in CNN detailing the abuses in Stay Timon. Then the New York Times released their own article on it. Both were backed up with Israeli sources, crossed with Palestinian ones. I dismissed them because my government sources and Israeli media denied them. My whole life I was told that the Israeli media was out to get Israel, that they were all anti-Semites. But today I realised how much I was lied to by my country, by my friends, by my media. Today, many of the people I talked to who denied these allegations admitted they were true. And the worst part, none of this is coming to light because the IDF and government have changed their hearts about it. It's coming out because the pressure from the UK, the International Criminal Court, and the International Court of Justice was getting too great to ignore. This would get Netanyahu, Gallant, and the Chief of Staff in serious trouble. So they finally said the truth, that Israel is routinely torturing inmates, that sexual abuse is fairly common there, that people have been tortured to death. Worst of all, many of the people in this facility were innocent, rounded up by accident, but there was no real verification process before they were subjected to this hell on earth. This can't go on, as he concludes there. Well, firstly, it's welcome that he's confirming the truth, that the Israeli state is systematically torturing and indeed raping detainees, many of whom are guilty of nothing other than being Palestinian civilians, arbitrarily abducted by Israeli soldiers, in other words, hostages. It's also important to note that international pressure, too limited, but what limited pressure exists is having an impact. And that pressure is in part coming about because of the work of not least Palestinian journalists who have risked their lives in the biggest slaughter of journalists ever recorded in any conflict to show the world the truth about what is happening to the Palestinian people, and also those who've been protesting and organising in countries, for example, like Britain, which is putting pressure on governments. But proper penitence would involve making amends for his own contribution in creating the culture which allowed the systematic violation of basic human rights. Last December, this analyst posted a picture of Palestinian detainees in Gaza stripped naked, except for their underwear, declaring that humiliating Hamas in an honour society weakens them. Well, how does he feel about that? How does he feel about flouting the Geneva Conventions now in order to defeat the enemy? The problem here is that Israel is a society in the grip of genocidal mania. It is unfortunately striking that after 10 months of barbarism, the one thing it took to get Israeli civilians to riot was support for raping Palestinians. Just imagine for a few seconds that Palestinians had been rioting in support of raping Israelis. Just imagine that for a minute. Imagine the headlines. Imagine how that would be served up about what this tells us about the Palestinian people in general. The allegations of rape during the 7th of October attacks were specifically offered up in support of committing genocide, of a genocidal onslaught against Gaza on the basis they showed the collective depravity of people who live there. So what now, eh? What now? The truth is, Israel is in the midst of genocidal mania. That's what we're discussing here. There are courageous voices within Israel, but they are so courageous precisely because they are so isolated. This horror will not end without external action. Israel has to be completely isolated internationally, turn into a pariah state like apartheid South Africa before it, with an arms embargo, comprehensive sanctions and boycotts. Otherwise, Israeli society will only sink further into an abyss of genocidal depravity. Things are dark now. Oh, my word, they can get even darker. We are looking at the consequences of impunity, of how genocidal mania takes a life of its own. It just gets worse and worse. A positive feedback loop. Nothing is stopping it. This is where total dehumanization gets you. And that's why pressure has to come from abroad, because those courageous and isolated individuals in Israel are never going to be able to stop the level of depravity that you have just listened to and heard with your own ears and seen with your own eyes. Please like and subscribe. Do leave your comments and thoughts as ever. Keep the show on the road at patreon.com/84. On the podcast, I know we have not been updating it properly. That is now being rectified, so please do listen on the podcast. And from now on, we will update along with the videos.